A warm July to all. My name is Tsewang Namgail. I work for the Snow Leopard Conservancy India Trust based in Ladakh. Today I'm going to tell you briefly about the flora and fauna of Ladakh. And I know it's a very vast topic and there are so many elements, so many species to cover, so I don't know if I can do justice to it, but I'll try. Ladakh is really known for its flora and fauna. Despite the high altitude and the low oxygen and cold temperature, we have a very high diversity of species of flora and fauna which are adapted to this high altitude condition. Talking about the diversity of the species in Ladakh, as I mentioned, that we have a very high diversity, and the reason for that is that Ladakh is at the junction, at the border between the Palearctic biogeographical realm and the Indo-Malay or the Oriental biogeographical realm. And that's the reason that we have a high diversity, because we get elements from both these biogeographical realms. And Ladakh also forms a transition zone between the vast open plains on the Tibetan plateau and the rugged mountains of Himalaya Hindu Kush in the western part of Ladakh. And so in Ladakh, especially in the central part of Ladakh, we get elements from both these different habitat types. For example, some species like the Tibetan argali and blue sheep, which are mountain ungulates, they come from the eastern part of Ladakh, and some species like the Asiatic avex and Ladakh Uriel, they come from the western part of Ladakh, from the Hindu Kush Himalayan mountains, and they meet somewhere in the middle of Ladakh, the central part of Ladakh. And so if you look at the Hemis National Park, it is the only place in Central Asia and Asia where these four species come together. Similarly, there are other species also. There are two species of marmots in Ladakh, the Himalayan marmot and the long-tailed marmot. And similarly, the long-tailed marmot is coming from the west and the Himalayan marmot is coming from the east. And in the central part of Ladakh, they coexist, they co-occur. Similarly, there are hare species that again come from the east and west, and they overlap in the central part of Ladakh. So Ladakh is really very diverse when we talk about flora and fauna, especially animals. So starting with some of the most charismatic species, let's talk about the predators first. At the top of the food chain is the snow leopard, which is the queen of the Himalayas, they also call it, or the ghost of the mountains, because it's such an elusive creature that is very difficult to find it in nature, and people spend months looking for one. Fortunately, today we have a group of very enthusiastic and passionate youth who have developed the skill to locate and find these animals in the wild, and all of us know that there is a very thriving snow leopard tourism that is going on in Ladakh currently. So snow leopard, if you look at the population, since it is the apex predator, I will spend a little bit more time on this species. Snow leopard occurs in some 12 Central and South Asian countries, including India, China, Mongolia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Nepal, and several other countries. And if you talk about the population of the snow leopard, there are some 5,000 to 7,000 estimated population in the world. And if you talk about the population in Himalaya and in the Indian Himalayas, is about 500 to 700. And we are very fortunate to have some 60% of that Indian population in Ladakh. And if you look at the distribution of snow leopards in Ladakh, it occurs all across Ladakh, but it is mostly concentrated in the western part of Ladakh, the Zanskar Mountains, and the Hemis National Park. The reason for that is snow leopard prefers rugged terrain, cliffy areas, and not so much of the open areas. And so we have less number of snow leopards in the eastern part of Ladakh. And snow leopard today is facing a lot of threats, ranging from climate change to retaliatory killing by farmers who lose their livestock to the snow leopard. And so there are a lot of other threats. And since it is at the top of the food chain, it is also a keystone species. Keystone species means that it plays a very important role in keeping a balance in nature, keeping an ecological balance, keeping the ecological integrity of a region, to keeping the ecosystem together. So the snow leopard plays a very important role, and so that's why it is also a keystone species, and it's also called a flagship species because it is a wide-ranging species. And if you spend time and efforts and invest in the conservation of snow leopard, and in that process you conserve a lot of other species which automatically get conserved with the conservation of the snow leopard's habitat. So a lot of people are working towards the conservation of snow leopard, and since we have a limited time, I'll just stop here, and then let's move forward. And then next we have the Tibetan wolf. It again is a very wide-ranging species. It is widely distributed in the world, and if you look at the distribution in Ladakh, it is distributed almost all across Ladakh. And the wolf is currently facing a very important threat, and that is hybridization with the free-ranging dogs, which everyone knows that the population of which is really exploding in Ladakh and all in other parts of the Himalayas. So it's really is a threat because it can dilute the gene pool of the wolf, and we soon might lose that unique species if we don't control the population of the free-ranging dogs. And so there are a lot of other issues, and since there is limited time, I won't spend much time on the individual species. So moving forward, we have next the Eurasian lynx, which is a beautiful cat, a large cat actually. It's not very it's not a small cat. It's a medium-sized cat, and if you look at the distribution of these particular species, it is distributed in many parts of Ladakh, but it has a very high concentration in the thickets around Deskit, Hundar, and Panamik, some of these villages and towns in Nubra Valley. So it has a very high concentration there. And if you look at the lynx, it has you can easily identify the species by looking at its ear, and the ears have a tuft of hair on them, so it's very easily identifiable. Moving on, we have the wild dog, the one that we call Flora in Ladakh. That again is a very it's not a very widely distributed species. It has a very small population. In fact, it's very rare, and so you don't see them that often. If you go towards the eastern part of Ladakh, around some of these high altitude lakes, especially to Sokar Thomoriri, there you might see them, and people have seen them in the western part of Ladakh also, but its population, nobody knows how many there are in Ladakh, and which is very unfortunate. Moving on, we have the Palace's cat, which is a small cat. It's a little larger than the house cat, and is a beautiful animal. The coat pattern is really beautiful. It has some bars, black bars on its tail, and the ears are placed very low so that it can ambush its prey, which are the paikas and voles in the eastern part of Ladakh, like places like Hanle and all. So it has these head structure, which is very unique to ambushing animals. And then we have the ungulate species, the mountain sheep and goats. We have eight of those. The wild yak, the Tibetan wild ass, the Tibetan antelope, the Tibetan gazelle, the blue sheep, the Tibetan argali, the Asiatic avex, and Ladakh Uriel. So these are the ungulates, and of them, 4 are mountain sheep and goats: blue sheep, Tibetan argali, Ladakh Uriel, and Asiatic avex. They are very unique animals, as I mentioned earlier. In the Rumbak area of the Hemis National Park, they come together, they coexist. That's the very unique place, because nowhere else, because they occur in some several Asian countries, but here is the only place that where they come together and where they co-occur. So it's a very unique place. So talking about these species individually, the wild yak is a very unique species. It's an endangered species. It's known all across the world. And Ladakh and Tibet is very famous for wild yaks. And if you talk about its numbers, there are not that many. There are about 250 to 300 individuals in Ladakh. And then you have the Tibetan antelope, which is again a very unique animal. This is the animal from which you get the fiber, the tush, shatush, which is in Persian the king of wools. So it's a very fine fiber, and it is really priced very highly in the international market. And this is the animal where you get the fiber to make the ring shawl. And a ring shawl in an international market can fetch up to $25,000, and so very expensive shawls. And so there is a story behind that also. How this animal, the population of this animal has been declining in the Tibetan plateau, and there has been an international force that really protested and banned actually the shatush trade. And so today there's a ban, but still, I think a limited trade is still happening clandestinely. And for many years in the past, many of the shatush shawl weavers, they kept on duping the international customers, people in Europe, that we don't kill these animals to make these shawls, but we collect the fiber that are stuck on rocks and bushes and all. We collect those fiber, and then we weave these shawls, which is not true. To make one shawl, you need to kill at least 3 males or 5 females to make one shawl. So that's, you cannot even harvest the wool when the animal is alive, because the wool is very short and very fine, so you cannot pick up the wool while the animal is alive, so you have to kill it. So that was a major issue with that animal, and fortunately now there has been some sort of restriction on its the harvesting of the wool. So the next we have the Tibetan Gazelle, which is again a very beautiful species. There is a story that His Holiness the Dalai Lama used to really love this animal when he was young and he was in Tibet. So while coming to Potala from his birthplace, they had found a gazelle which was injured, and so they picked up the injured gazelle and they kept in the Nurbulingka palace for many years. And His Holiness really enjoyed looking at the gazelle, and it's really a beautiful creature. If you go to the eastern part of Ladakh, you'll find them mostly in the Hanle area and nowhere else in Ladakh. And so it's a very small population of about 100 to 150 individuals. If you see it from a distance, if you see the rump patch, it has a heart-shaped pattern on the on its rump, so you can identify it very easily from a distance. It's a beautiful creature, as I mentioned earlier. And then we have the Tibetan wild ass. Of course, there's a huge conflict between the Tibetan wild ass and the people in Changtang, because the people believe that the wild ass is degrading the pastures in the eastern part of Ladakh, and they don't leave any stone unturned, shooing this animal away from their pastures, because they believe that the Kyang eats day and night without any rest, and which is not true. It has to sleep, so it eats mostly in the morning, evening, and some during the day. But being a hindgut fermenter, it does consume a lot of pasturage, like a lot of grass, and on the sage meadows, it feeds on species like carex and cobrizia and all. So that has been a major contention, and people are trying to find a solution there. And then moving to now the mountain ungulates, we have the Asiatic avex, which is a true goat, and it occurs mostly in the western part of Ladakh, in the Zanskar mountains and Kargil area. And if you talk about the population of these species, there are about 6,000 individuals in Ladakh, and it's really a majestic creature. And there is a lot of story on these particular species. And then we have the Tibetan argali, which is the largest wild sheep in the world. And if you look at the distribution, it is distributed mostly in the eastern part of Ladakh, with a very small population in the Rumbak area and the Hemis National Park. And that population has a very unique story, actually. That population grew out of 3 individuals, which ended up in the Rumbak area in 1979. And some people were seeing them for the first time, and they found the species very beautiful, and so they protected them. But at that time, we had these paramilitary forces going up in the mountains and killing wild animals. So some military personnel had killed 2 of the males. Fortunately, the third one was a female, and fortunately that was pregnant. And so we have a small population, about 25 odd argalis in the national park, and that grew out of those 3 individuals. So it's a very unique thing. And if you talk about the population of these particular species in Ladakh, we don't have more than 300 species. So it's really a species that is highly threatened in Ladakh, and we should be conserving it because it's a beautiful species. And then we have the blue sheep. Well, the blue sheep is neither blue nor sheep. So it's surprising why people call it, I don't know why people call it blue sheep. Maybe some people, early naturalists, had come to some of these places, and the blue sheep does have a slaty color, a tinge of slaty color, if you look at it from an angle, especially when the sun is shining. So probably they thought that it was blue. And it's not a sheep, it's a mix between a sheep and a goat. It has goat-like characteristics. For example, when they fight, they rear up on their hind legs and then they clash. Unlike sheep, which come running from a distance and then they clash. So that's a very goat-like character that the blue sheep has. And looking at its habitat use, the blue sheep occurs in very rugged terrain. Along with the Asiatic avex, these 2 species are very unique actually. They are known for their climbing skills, especially the Asiatic avex, and sometimes you see them in very steep cliffs with hardly any ledge or anything to hold onto. And so yeah, their main forte is climbing up, especially when they are scared by a predator like the snow leopard or the wolf. They just run into these rocks and cliffs where they feel secure. But the snow leopard is also agile, and it can also go in very steep cliffs. But the thing is that when the snow leopard hunts in very steep cliffs, then there is a danger of falling down with the prey. And so evolutionarily what happens is that the genes that are known for those kind of brave activities, like going in very steep cliffs and killing these animals, those genes automatically get eliminated from the population. And so that's how we have these species that have been co-evolving together. Okay, so then the last but not the least, among the ungulates we have the Ladakh Uriel, and that's a very unique species because since its name is after our place Ladakh, it is in fact an endemic species to Ladakh, and it occurs mostly along the Indus River and Shyok River. And so it has a very restricted distribution. If you go further into some of the interior valleys, you don't find them. And if you look at the population of this species, we don't have more than 2,800 to 3,000 species individuals in Ladakh. So it is quite threatened, and it is all the more important to conserve this species because it is unique to Ladakh, and it's also the smallest wild sheep in the world, in fact. Yeah, so these are about the ungulates. And then we have some smaller species like the marmot. We have two species. Now I'll speed up a bit because I think we don't have much time. We have two species of marmots. One is the long-tailed marmot, the other one is the Himalayan marmot. As I mentioned earlier, that the Himalayan marmot is mostly distributed in the east on the Tibetan plateau, and the long-tailed marmot is distributed in the western part in the Hindu Kush Himalayas, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all this. So in in Ladakh, they occur mostly in Kargil, in Zanskar, in the western part of Ladakh. And talking about the hares, we have two species of hare. One is the Cape hare, the other one is Tibetan woolly hare. The Tibetan woolly hare is coming from the eastern part of it is distributed in the eastern part of Ladakh, and then we have the Cape hare, which is distributed mostly in Nubra. Cape hare is again coming from Africa, and the Tibetan woolly hare is coming from the Tibetan plateau. And in the central part of Ladakh, there are some locations, some places where they overlap in their distribution. And looking at some of the smaller species, we have the weasels, we have the mountain weasel, we have the Himalayan weasel, and then we have 5 species of pikas: the Ladakh pika, Nubra pika, large-eared pika, and then black-lipped pika, and Royalese pika. And then we have 3 species of voles. Voles and pikas are different. The voles tend to have a very narrow muzzle compared to pikas, and pikas don't hibernate during winter. Yes, so these are the mammals that I told you about. And then a very interesting another species which is an omnivore is the brown bear. And we have 2 species of brown bear in Ladakh. One is not species, or a subspecies. So it is a subspecies of the same brown bear, the species that the grizzly bear and all of that, they belong to the same family and the same genus. And so we have the Himalayan brown bear and the Tibetan brown bear. The Tibetan brown bear mostly we have very rare visitors from the western part of the Tibetan plateau, while the Himalayan brown bear has a larger presence in Ladakh. It occurs mostly in Kargil and Zanskar areas. And we have been having a lot of issues with this particular species, probably with the changing climate, the climate becoming warmer. These animals tend to be active in the winter. Otherwise, in the normal years, they go under hibernation, and then they come out of their dens in early spring. but they have been delaying their hibernation period. The entry into the dens, and they have been coming out, emerging from those dens earlier in the spring because of the warming climate. Well, that is something that still needs to be substantiated with data, but that's the anecdotal information and understanding till now. And brown bear creates a lot of problems, and so they come to homes, houses, and attack the Russian stores. And fortunately, there hasn't been any fatal attack on humans, so that is a good part. And people have been telling us that the population is increasing, and then local people believe that the population is increasing because of more bridges coming up in the last 2 decades or so. And that's because when brown bears cross rivers and streams, they cross with their cubs on their backs. And what happens is that oftentimes it can just carry one cub at a time, and while crossing with one cub on its back, the other one follows. So usually it gives 2 cubs, and while other one is following, he or she, that the other cub gets washed down or get drowned while crossing the stream. So now with the bridges, they can easily cross these rivers and streams. Well, that's a belief among people. We need to substantiate that with data. Now coming to the birds, Ladakh is very unique for birds. We have both migratory birds and resident birds. Some birds come to Ladakh to breed in the summer, and there are some winter visitors that come to Ladakh, especially in the winter. For example, the white-winged redstart that come to Ladakh from places like Siberia and Mongolia and all, which are very cold. So compared to those places, Ladakh is warmer in the winter. And one thing that I would like to highlight here is that many of these species, we have been seeing a decline in their populations, and we think that it's because of the over-harvesting of the Cestalulu or the Cestalulu's berries. And what happens is that when people over harvest that, see, these birds come in the winter, and also they feed on these the dried berries, so they get find very little for themselves. If people over harvest and bit the bushes, and then they take everything, and that is creating ecological imbalances in Ladakh. And people have been telling us that in some places like She, Thiksay and all, they see a greater incidence of pest incidences occurring, and that is probably can be related to the decline in the population of this particular species, because they don't just feed on the dried berries, they also feed on eggs of many of these insect pests which lay eggs in the bushes and all. So this needs to be investigated, and that is something that people need to be very mindful of, because there's not just with the species but a lot of other things that with the seabuck thorns berries being collected at a very large scale, this could be an issue in future. So anyway, so if we talk about some of the raptors, we have some beautiful and very elegant birds like the golden eagle. Golden eagle is a very interesting, a very unique species. It is known to hunt its own prey, so it preys on smaller mammals and smaller birds like pikers and marmots and all. They hunt even the woolly hare. And so they are known for hunting on their own. Unlike a species like the bearded vulture or the lammer Guy, which is another very unique species in Ladakh. These particular species, the lammer Guy, is known for its skill of breaking bones. So what it does that, because it feeds on bone marrow, so what it does is that if it find a kill, it just picks up the bones and then fly really high, and then drop those bones on some rocks and all, so to crash them. And so once the bones are crashed, then come down and then feed on the bone marrow. And so that particular species is known for that. Then we have another species called the Himalayan griffin, or the Himalayan vulture, or the griffin. That's again a very huge vulture, and it's known for scavenging. And you will see that its head is bald, so it does not have much feather on the hair, and that's to just keep itself clean, because since it feeds on carcasses in dead animals, there is a great possibility of spread of pathogens and getting sick and all. So having a bald head and not having any feather on the head is helps in keeping itself clean. And this particular species is very important again, and we talk about ecosystem services, and in ecosystem services, animals benefit us in many ways, keeping ourselves healthy, providing us food, provide us with clean drinking water, clean air, and all of that. So this particular animal cleans all the dead animals and carcasses, so thereby then reducing the possibility of spread of pathogens. So it is really these animals, these birds are the municipal committee, if you will, for the bird world and also for humans. So it's paying a very important service. And then coming to now some of the other species, herbivores, for example, that feed on grasses. We have the ducks and geese. For example, the bar-headed goose, that's a bird that feeds on plants and grasses, and so it's a very important species again. The bar-headed goose is known for its high altitude flying. In fact, it is at the moment it is the most the highest flying bird in the world. There have been observed crossing the Himalayas right above the Mount Everest and many high peaks in the Himalayas. So they do that quite regularly, not taking help of tailwind or the hot air, the updraft, and all of that in the Himalayas, but with its sheer muscle power, it just continuously flap its wings. So because there are a lot of birds which make use of these tailwinds and updrafts and hot air and all, when they rise up next to the mountains, they just make use of that, get into those hot air columns and then get a lift, like the vultures, for example. But this particular species, it just flaps its wings continuously. And so yes, this is a very unique species, and there have been a lot of research on that particular species, and people found that it has a higher concentration of blood capillaries around the heart for the gas exchange. So that's how it manages to achieve that high altitude flying. And another species that is very akin to the bar-headed goose is the ruddy-shelled duck, or the Brahminid duck, it's also called. It's a beautiful bird again. Oftentimes you'll see them together. And unlike the bar-headed goose, the Brahminid duck is a omnivore, so it feeds on small insects and invertebrates as well as plants and grasses. So if you want to see the bar-headed goose, then you should go to lakes like this Tatsapukso and Tsomoriri, because Tsomoriri is not a freshwater lake, it's a brackish freshwater lake, whilst Tatsapukso is a freshwater lake. So they tend to feed, all these freshwater lakes tend to have more vegetation around them, and so you will find these bar-headed geese along the shores of some of these freshwater lakes, while you see the species like Brahminid ducks in areas where there's a good supply of grasses as well as invertebrates, insects and all. So if you want to see the Brahminid duck, you should go to the Sokar area, because the good thing about that place is that it has a freshwater lake and a brackish lake right next to each other. Around the mud flats, in the mud flats around the brackish lake, there tends to be a lot of invertebrates and small aquatic insects and all, while the Statsapukso provides good grasses. So it's a very good habitat for Brahmini ducks. So if you want to see Brahmini ducks, you should go to Tsokar area, not Tsomoriri area. While to see the bar-headed goose, you should go to Tsomoriri. So similarly, there are a lot of other ducks and geese. We don't have much to go into each one of them, and some other ducks are the what you call the northern shoveler, the northern pintail, the gargani, mallard, and all of those. There are a lot of ducks like that. And now coming to the smaller ones, the passerines, the songbirds, there are a lot of them. There are both migratory and resident species. So till now, more than 170 have been reported as the migratory species, and there are a lot of resident species also. So many of these small birds also come to Ladakh from long distances. The white-winged redstart I already told you about, but there are a lot of other species like the desert wheat-ear, and a lot of those species, they also come to Ladakh from many places. The finches, the rose finch is a very beautiful species. There are two species of rose finches, the common rose finch and the great rose finch. Similarly, you have the horned lark, and a lot of those small species. We don't have time to get into each one of them. So now let's move on to the reptiles. And there are okay, so talking about the numbers of birds in Ladakh, till now I think there have been a lot of recent reports of new sightings and new records for Ladakh. So currently I think there are more than 300 species of birds in Ladakh. And so talking about now reptiles and the frogs and toads and all, the collectively called Harpytofauna. And so if we talk about the Harpytofauna species, we have some 4 species of snakes. A lot of people ask me if there are snakes in Ladakh. Yes, there are snakes in Ladakh, and we have the Himalayan pit viper, we have the trinket snake, and we have the Jan's cliff racer, and we have the Indian red snake. The red snake and the Jan's cliff racer, they are not poisonous. The Himalayan pit viper is poisonous. Well, the Jan's cliff racer has a little bit of very mild poison, but it's really not dangerous. And similarly, we have 2 species of skinks, the Himalayan skink and the Ladakh skink. These are the reptiles that we call Plinkiti in Ladakhi. And then we have the agamas, we have the rock agama, the Himalayan rock agama, Galchik. And then we have the reticulated agama, and then we have the tor-headed gama. So these are the different species. If you walk on the, especially in the Tsokar area and the high altitude area, you tend to find a lot of these tor-headed agamas. And then we have 3 species of frogs. So that makes a total of 11 species of Harpytofauna. And then now moving on to some of the smaller species, the smaller animals. Let's talk about the insects. And in fact, we don't have a lot of information about insects in Ladakh. There are a lot of butterflies in Ladakh, and there are a lot of also moths in Ladakh. The most important butterflies are the Apollo butterflies, and then we have the Ladakh tortoiseshell, we have the common swallowtail, common yellow swallowtail, and we have the Ladakh copper and a lot of blues. And so there are more than 100 species of butterflies in Ladakh, in fact, and a couple of them are quite unique to Ladakh. You will just find in Ladakh and nowhere else. So there are some, including some moths. So especially the hawk moths. So yes, I mean these are some very brief account of all the animals, and of course, I mean it's just a fraction of the number of species that we have in Ladakh. I'm not talking about a lot of the smaller ones, the lesser known ones, and that is something that we need to do more research on and find out what species we have. So that was about the fauna, about the animals. Now let's talk about the plants. Alright, so now let's talk about the plants of Ladakh, and there are a lot of plants, of course, given the high altitude and very little precipitation and all of that. We have again a very high diversity of plant species. Till now, some more than 1,000 species have been reported from Ladakh, which is very high for a place like Ladakh, which is very dry and high. In fact, we sometimes make a joke that God left us high and dry, but I think that is more both literally as well as figuratively. So there we have a lot of plant species anyway, and it's very important to talk about plants because they are the basis of all the life, all the other species that we have, that the animals, for example, that I told you about. All those animals wouldn't be surviving Ladakh had we not have all the plant species that I'll be talking about. So obviously we don't have time to really get into all the species and details. So I'll just talk about a few species that are very important, especially from a ethnobotanic point of view, and how people have been interacting with trees and herbs and bushes and all of that. So let's start with the juniper tree. It is a very significant tree, and we have a few species of juniper trees in Ladakh, and it occurs in many places, especially in the western part of Ladakh and Nubra and all. We have good concentration of trees. In the past we had more, but what had happened in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, people really over harvested juniper tree, both for as a fuel, but as well as a culturally significant twigs, because we use the twigs for many things. So anyway, at some point, some villagers also kind of used dynamite to blow up the entire tree. They just put dynamite in the roots and then just blew up. And so that was really not a sustainable harvesting. And that's something that people should have thought about it long ago. But it's not late today. We still have quite a few stands of trees in many parts of Ladakh, especially in the western part of Ladakh, Zanskar and all, as I said. And juniper trees, they don't grow on open slopes that much. It grows mostly in rocky areas. And I think the reason for that is the aeration of the roots. The roots need a little bit more air. My understanding is that. And then obviously it's very difficult to grow juniper. Its seeds goes in a very long dormancy, and it's very difficult to break the dormant stages of these seeds. And there are some ways actually. Many years ago, I had a conversation with the district forest officer, DFO of Ladakh, and he once told me that they tried to grow juniper, but they didn't get any success. And then he told me that he had heard about a story that if you put choughs or droppings as a manure, then the juniper plants grow faster, and that's what he had heard. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking on that, and I was reflecting on that for quite some time. And then later I realized that it was not actually the droppings of the chaff that was promoting the growth of the juniper plant. But what was happening was that the choughs actually eat the seeds of the juniper trees, and when the seed passes through the gut of the chaff, then it gets that hard covering gets dissolved, and then it becomes easier to grow the seed. And so I think that's the reason. And so you'll see that the chaff and many birds are the seed dispersers of this tree. So we should also look at which birds are involving in spreading the seed and try to conserve those birds, because it is also important from the juniper perspective. So yes, that's the and as I said, the juniper is really a good fuel wood. People would call them skamshak, and they would often use that as a tinder wood also. When I was a kid, I remember using that as a tinder wood. Now, coming to some of the more common species of trees, we have the willows and poplars, and we don't need to. Everyone knows, where they grow. But we have a few species of these trees. We have a few species of poplar. We have the Populus nigra, we have the Populus alba, and the Populus alba are the ones with the stator bolts, which are good good to use as beams in houses and all. The Populus nigra is the harder one, and that is good for several other things, including making of things like gurgur and all of that. So these are the poplar trees, and then we have the willow trees. There are a few species of willow trees in Ladakh, and there are some willow trees that have very stunted growth. So for example, if you go to places like Rangdum and all, there you will there also one might see from a distance that there are no trees there. But if you look at the willow, there is a very willow species that has a very stunted growth. It just looks like a bush, but basically it's a willow tree. So, and then talking about some other species, we have the birch trees. If you go to places like Hanupata and that area, there you'll see some of these birch trees. And we also surprisingly came to know that a higher ridge somewhere in Wanla area, they also have pine trees, something that we called Thangshing. So they have pine trees there also, and I want to go there and see it for myself one day. So that also raises the question as to why this particular place has a pine tree and no other place in Ladakh is pine tree. And so it could be that probably it had a wider distribution in the past, and because of over harvesting and people cutting them down, it probably just remained in this small refuge. They were telling me that to get to that place, you have to really struggle a lot using long staircases and all to get to that place. So sounds like it is a refuge of this particular species. I don't know which species it is, but it's the pine tree. And then, of course, we have all the fruit trees in the western part of Ladakh. The apricots are known for, Ladakh is known for apricot trees, and apricot is really good because, and I think that is something that people should keep in mind, that apricot is really designed for this place. If you eat apricots, and it really fulfills a lot of your body's requirements. Our body, being at a high altitude, we need a lot of iron to distribute all the oxygen in our body. The hemoglobin and iron is a very important constituent of that. And so apricot has a lot of iron content, and it's really good for health. Being a Ladakhi, we should consume more apricot, but there are a few other fruit sources that have good irons in Ladakh. We can talk about that some other time. And then, of course, apple, again, a lot of iron and a lot of other things that are good for the body. And And then we have some other trees like the Russian olives, something what we call sarsing, and it is really known for the good high fragrance of its flowers, the yellow flowers. So these are the trees. And then if we talk about there are some very significant important shrubs, like the seabuckthorn, all of us know is a wonderberry, people call it, but the problem is there is over harvesting. We need to keep that in mind and see how we can control the harvesting level, and so that we can keep an ecological balance. So that isn't, and then we have the wild rose. That's again is a very important species that have in Ladakh. In fact, you will see that in many parts of Ladakh growing on the slopes. So these species are very good in controlling floods also, because they retain the soil, and it maintains the integrity of the soil. And the wild rose is beautiful to look at its flowers. It has very nice fragrance of the flowers, and then I think the flower petals can be used to make rose water, and rose hips can people use it as a tea, and so things like that. There are a lot of usages, and all we need to do is just find out and explore. But the only thing that we need to keep in mind is that we don't overexploit them. Otherwise, we will also lose them, just the way we lost much of our juniper. And so similarly, we might lose these species also. And these are very important for Ladakh, especially in the controlling floods and all of that. And then we have another species called the rabies species, what we call axcuta, and that is also people kind of uprooted that for keeping their houses warm and cooking and all of that as a fuel wood. And then there is another species called Karagana, which is again a very important species, because it fixes nitrogen, and so it gives refuge to a lot of other plant species like small herbs and all under it, because it has a huge canopy, and it has a lot of spines, so it prevents overgrazing. Because of the spines, they are not grazed that much by wild ungulates and domestic ungulates also. So many of these smaller herbs and plants get refuge under the canopy of the Karagana. And then we have species like Ecantholemon, which is used for what we call longze, which is also currently being used as a fuel wood in many villages. And then similarly, Artemisia, that's a very important source for fuel wood, and so a lot of people went up in the mountains, uprooting them and then drying them and using that as a fuel wood in the winter. And similarly, ephedra, it has a lot of medicinal values. So talking about now medicinal values, there are a lot of medicinal plants in Ladakh. And we don't have time to look at all of them one by one. So let's just talk about some very important medicinal plants. Arnivia, for example, is very important. Ephedra and many of the seabuckthorn and all of that, those have also high medicinal value. So yeah, I mean there are innumerable medicinal plants, but I think it would be better now if I talk about some edible wild plants. We have a lot of vegetables that we grow in our gardens, like cabbage and chard and lettuce and all of that. But there are a lot of wild edible plants which are very good, full of antioxidants. And I think this is something that people should know, that people of Ladakh faces a problem. There's something called the oxidative stress. So what happens is that because of the low oxygen and all of that, we often tend to switch to anaerobic respiration, which means respiration without oxygen, and that kind of leads to a situation called the oxidative stress. And what happens is that it generates a lot of free radicals in our body, and we need a particular chemical called something called an antioxidant to counter that. And all the plant species, especially the wild plants, are full of antioxidants, and that is also there have been several research looking at that, and they found a very high concentration of antioxidants in some of these plants and edible plants. For example, the most important one on which there was a very significant research done, which is the pepperweed or the Lepidium latifolium. It's in Ladakh, it's called shangsho, and that is really good because it's full of antioxidants, a lot of other phytovitamins that are good for our health. So we should be consuming these wild plants as much as we can. But again, it's very important to keep in mind that we should not overexploit, and if we overexploit and don't let them seed and fruit and all, then I think we'll be just kind of driving them to extinction, right? So we won't have much left in the future. So that sustainable harvesting is something that people really need to keep in mind. And the next edible plant that I would like to talk about is the kappa bush. It's really good. It has a lot of antioxidants again, and a lot of phytovitamins. And so these are very important for the health. And kappa bush, in fact, you can consume both the flower buds as well as the leaves. So they are really very healthy. And then another very important edible plant species that every Ladakhi would know, especially the people like for the ex-gen people and people before that, that it is really good. I mean, especially in the winter. So a lot of people go and collect the leaves of this. We call it zatsot, the stinging nettle. So yeah, the stinging nettle is really good for health. People go and collect the leaves in the summer and dry them for the winter, and they consume with the they put in soup and a lot of other things. So that's really very healthy too. Now these are some of the edible vegetables that you collect from the mountains, but we have some edible vegetables, wild edible plants just next to our agricultural fields, or along the edges of the agricultural fields. And these are, for example, plantago, which is again a very tasty and very healthy vegetable. It's called kararutse also in some parts of Ladakh. And we have the blue lettuce, or we call it skyas in a certain part of Ladakh, or khawa or khalwa in some parts of Ladakh, and that again is really good. A lot of good things in it, very healthy. And then similarly, dandelion, or what we call khorkhorma, that's again is a very important edible plant species that people should consume again because it is really good for health. And similarly, there are some species that gives us condiments like karam karvi. We can also eat the entire plant when they are tender. Then they are small. We can eat the entire plant of karam karvi. And so yes, I mean these are some very significant and important edible plant species that people should look out for. In this every time in the spring, all the Ladakhi people are seen queuing up in front of the Kashmiri vegetable vendors to buy vegetables that are really not healthy. I mean, they look very healthy. Their leaves are broad and green, but they don't really have much of the nutrients that our body needs. On the other hand, we have all these plants growing right in our backyard, but we ignore it because partly the youth and younger generation, they don't know the value of those plants, and they don't know where to find them and pick them up. And so that's the reason that they are not collecting. So yeah, these are a very brief account of the flora and fauna, and yes, I mean there are so many of them. I just touched upon them, and there are so many things to talk about. Their stories and their natural history and the threats they are facing. But in a short time, we cannot talk about all of that. And I hope to be engaged and talk to students and youth more and more in future. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. Thank you.